back tears on the phone when I got the call that I got the job. And it was just so exciting to be, to move from a local news station to a national platform, was really surreal. It still is. Sometimes when I'm like, scrolling through an article on CBC and suddenly there's like an ad with my face on it and my name, it's still kind of weird. And, I think even for my family, I remember when I got hired, we were still kind of developing the show. So it didn't have a name yet. And we were talking about what the name was going to be. And I kind of floated, we'd floated some ideas. And I was talking to my mom on the phone. And I said, we're trying to figure out a name. And there was some talk about calling it like Ginella Massa Live or Ginella Massa Tonight. And my mom was like, wait a second. It's your show? Yeah. I said, yes, Mom. Like I've been hired for like a month. Or I'm like, I explained this to you. She's like, it didn't really compute to her. Like it didn't make sense to her. She didn't realize. She just thought I'd been hired at the CBC and I was going to anchor a show or, and I was maybe part of a team of a newscast. She didn't realize like it was just me. So that was kind of a funny moment.
She like comes back to you. It's like, okay, I know you're happy you're hired, but like, listen, they're not giving you your own show yet. And then you're like, no, actually they are. And then you're just like, she's like, hold on. I just got to take a 5 minutes break.
Yeah, totally.
I think it's funny because, I was going to mention to you, like, we had Strombo had his own show for a while that was called The Hour. And then I think it was called George Stropolopoulos Tonight. Mm-hmm. I actually got that out. That whole sentence. I was just like, I was waiting for me to mess up on that. But yeah, it's interesting because I guess I kind of like the title just because you have Canada Tonight. And like, this is me. I know we both have communication degrees. I have mine from Carleton, but this is me kind of going into a little bit dissecting into it. Because if you just called it like your own show, like your name, and that's it, I'd be like, okay, like,
what is it?
Yeah. Like it's still.
That's how I felt. Yeah, I was opposed. To having it be named after me, especially because I thought, well, people in Canada don't really know me. I'm not a household name. Like, what is this going to mean to them, right? Yeah. And the show is not about me, right? I want it to be a window into Canada. So I had other suggestions. I wanted it to be called what was my suggestion? I think it was Canada Connected. Okay. But there used to be a show on CBC called Connect with Mark Kelly. So that was kind of vetoed because they didn't want to repeat a similar title. And so I actually wasn't a huge fan of the title when it first was presented to me, Canada Tonight. I thought it sounded too much like a newscast and we really wanted to do more in-depth conversations. But then one of the senior producer said, well, what I like about it is, this is what we're talking about in Canada tonight, or this is what's happening in Canada tonight. And that kind of made me go, I like that. And so I was sold. And that is what we use as our intro every night when we do our headlines. This is what we're talking about in Canada tonight. That resonated with me.
I like that, but the way that I was looking at it is kind of more as inclusive is it's almost like, okay, so we're talking about Canada. Like tonight in Canada, but with you as a host, it's like, look at where we're going in Canada, or look at like, it's like the melting pot of like, hey, like for me, myself, I'm a person with disability. Now it's a very invisible disability, but if someone like, for example, I hope the day comes where CBC, CTV or something hires someone with a disability, I'm like, all right. And if it's called, just say Canada AM or whatever, you're like, oh, okay. Like now I can see someone like myself on TV and be like, okay, it's not just me on TV of like, this is me and my disability, let's talk about it. It's like, I'm included in this whole bigger world.
Absolutely.
Like when I want to ask you too, like, how did you get interested in journalism? Because, we all idolize someone to get into a certain field. Like me, I like comedy. I loved Conan. I loved like watching Colin Mockery on Whose Line. Podcasting to me was like almost a way of getting your humor, but doing interviews because I liked interviews. But I had someone to look up to. Who was someone that like you looked up to and said, I want to be a broadcaster?
Well, I was that kid who was always chatting, always talking, always wanting to be the center of attention, a little too much. That was like the number one comment on my report card was like, Ginella's a good student, but she talks too much in class when she's not supposed to. So I was always kind of that energetic, kid. And I think my parents knew that like, oh, she's going to do something in the spotlight. She's going to do something, on TV. And my mom would kind of encourage me like, oh, you should host a show. And I thought I was going to do something more like lifestyle. I wasn't necessarily interested in like news or politics. I thought I was going to, host a daytime show or a a lifestyle kind of show. And I studied broadcast journalism, and I had my internship at CTV Toronto, and I kind of, would see the inner workings of the newsroom and see, these reporters rushing to get their deadline and realizing that like news is just storytelling. And, everyone has a story if we just ask. And I thought that was really cool, being able to, be the vehicle to take a piece of information and turn it into something interesting that people want to watch and hear. And so, I mean, for a long time, obviously because I didn't see anyone who looked like me working in TV news, I thought there was a moment where I thought, maybe I'll go into radio, because then it doesn't matter what I look like, Yeah. But my mom, again, was the one who kind of encouraged me, like, don't change your dreams, don't change your goals. This is something that obviously you're really good at, you were made for. So go for it, right? And just because it hasn't been done before doesn't mean you can't be the first.
Yeah, people always tell me I have a face for radio, and I'm starting to believe them.
That's not
they're like that kid over there, he has a face for radio. And if you're young, you're like, oh my God, that's the biggest compliment in the world. Then when you get older, you're like, hold on a second.
Wait a minute.
What are you actually saying? But I do like your point there, because it's when you look at the world now, I mean, there's so many platforms, and for you, hopefully this comes more across as a compliment, but it's like, now there are probably kids out there that are looking at you and saying, well, if she's doing it, why can't I? And that don't necessarily mean they want to do it in the TV. They could do radio, or they could be saying, well, it's Canada. It's like, she's doing something on TV. Why can't I be like the first dancer with like a hijab, or whatever their goal is?
Absolutely. And that is a big part of, what keeps me motivated and what keeps me going, because this is a hard industry to be in. It's not easy. But when I do get messages from people saying exactly that, I had a girl who dressed up as me for Halloween. And that was really crazy last year. And so, seeing that, people saying, now I think about this as a possible career goal for me. Or, as you say, think about going into an industry where I have never seen someone who looks like me, but I shouldn't stop myself from doing it just because it's never been done before. So that is something that really keeps me motivated, especially on the hard days.
Now, I want to ask you like a little bit of a difficult question here as well. But like, when you were starting in journalism, in broadcasting, and like you were doing your Rogers internships, your News 1010, like, were there people inside that? And again, we're not naming names here, but it's like, were there people inside that were probably like, hey, like, you could go farther if you just remove the hijab, or like, if you presented yourself this way?
It's so interesting because I never really had anyone say that to my face. And, and in some ways I feel really lucky, because then it made me feel like the only person standing in my way is me. Right. The interesting thing about Canada is that we're very polite with our racism. And so, people didn't make overt comments to me or said, you'll never make it in this industry, or no one's going to hire you, or whatever. But I do know that those conversations were had. I found out years later from one of my classmates that I had a professor who had approached a friend of mine and said, Ginella's really good, but I worry that she's, going to have a hard time in this industry wearing hijab. Would you talk to her and ask her, would she ever consider removing it? And it's so interesting. She didn't feel like she could have that conversation with me because she knew she could get in trouble for that, right? That's discrimination, essentially.
Yeah.
And same for a hiring manager. A hiring manager could never say that to me, but that doesn't mean that I wasn't passed over for a job because of it. And my friend at the time, she was horrified that the teacher was asking her this, and was like, no, like, I'm not going to ask her that. That's ridiculous. And didn't tell me about it until I had already, like, 5 years later, when I was working in news as a broadcaster. And she said, hey, I just wanted to let you know, like, I actually had this conversation with our professor, and I'm so glad that I didn't, like, tell you about it back then, because I wouldn't want anything to kind of get in your way or get in your head about what you could or couldn't do. And so that was really interesting to me. I'd had a producer when I was working as a producer, and I wasn't on air yet. I was working behind the scenes, who just kind of in passing made a comment. I was talking about a friend of mine who was Muslim and who was a reporter. And he said, oh, does she wear a hijab? And I said, no. And he said, oh, yeah, they'd never put a woman in hijab on TV. It's too distracting. And he said it so flippantly, not knowing that this was something that I was like trying to strive for. But that was a moment in my head where I was like, we'll see, and hopefully I'll prove him wrong. Right. Yeah. So I feel really lucky that I didn't deal with a lot of overt kind of discrimination. But I often had to be the one to address the elephant in the room when I was, going for a job interview and say, listen, I get that this is going to be different and new, and maybe you have some apprehensions or some concerns or questions that you're afraid to ask. Like, let's talk about it. Let's hash it out. Let's get it out there. And I think that helped a little bit.
Yeah, because I feel like in a similar situation to yours, like I feel like when I go apply for jobs or internships, it's like I'll put down I'm a person with a disability, but it's because they don't see the disability. It's like, so, it's Sturge-Weber syndrome. It causes like seizures, whatever. But like, because it's not obvious, it's like, okay, what do we do with him? Like if we put him in a hiring pool or if we hire him, like what's the
there's an assumption too about what your limitations might be.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
And because there's fear about talking about it, they may just say, this is too much to deal with, so we're just going to go with someone else, rather than saying, how can we mitigate this? Or what are the things that we need to understand? And how can we make sure that this is an environment that you can thrive in? Right. Because often it just requires a little bit of conversation and understanding. But the problem is people get scared to ask. They're afraid to offend. But I think that assumptions are more dangerous than having an honest conversation.
Yeah, they're worse. It's almost like if you go into a place and it's like, well, I don't want to ask him about that. It's like, well, he mentioned it. It's like, yeah, it's just easier just to let him go. It's like, okay, but if you had to ask me and let me explain it, then you would have probably like, oh my God, okay, woo, we didn't have to do that much. It's like, yeah, okay. So, but I do think it's interesting because, like you were saying, is they're not openly about it. It's a closed door. But I would think, because from someone who's I haven't had anyone face to face tell me these, but like if someone had come to me later in life and be like, you didn't get this because they were afraid of this, I'd be like, yeah, I would think I would be a little bit rattled. And then I think like my whole landscape would be like, all right, we'll change careers because clearly this isn't working. But I appreciate the fact she tells you after the fact.
Yeah. I think that it helped that I was in a secure place where it's like, obviously she was wrong. And so it made it easier to brush it off. But you're right. If it had been something that had been brought to me when I was still very early in my career, who knows how much that could have affected me and impacted me from even trying to pursue this.
Yeah, I can imagine like one day like you're at Seneca or something doing like a hit, and then next minute someone's like, what happened to the hijab? You're like, it just decided not to wear it today. It's like, did someone say something to you? No, I was just going for a new look. It's like, yeah, no, someone definitely said something.
And you know what the reality is, especially as a woman in TV, like forget Muslim, but like as a woman in TV, there is so much conversation about your appearance, how you look, your hair, your makeup, your nails. And like people think that is a part of the conversation that goes along with your skills. And that's also really frustrating. For the men who work in the industry, it's not something they have to worry about. But for women, we have to also think about, our appearance and how we present ourselves, because that's another, part of the puzzle when they're deciding who gets the job and who doesn't, that they're evaluating. Yeah. It's kind of frustrating too.
I think it's funny because we had actually Jennifer Hedger on like almost a year, like I think it was like last January, and she was saying like, at TSN there's a lot more females than males, but she said it's interesting, she likes working with males because like if you have a disagreement or something on set, it's like, okay, well, we had that disagreement, we go live, we do the show, it's over. And then she was like, with females, it's almost like the little bit of a cattiness to it of almost like, okay, well, we still didn't solve. Yeah, it's like we still didn't solve the issue here. Where males like, all right, like, geez, okay, we said that like 5 minutes ago. You're still holding that against us? Okay, whatever. But I
haven't had that experience. I'm really lucky that I worked with a lot of, really great women who are, we support each other. And I think that that's the important thing, right? Is a lot of times society pits women against each other, right? Yeah. And makes you feel like you have to be in competition. There's only room for one of you, right? And so I think that the more we try to get away from that and try to encourage and lift each other up as women, I think that's really important, because they're going to try to do it to us, so we shouldn't do it to ourselves.
Yeah, I never actually thought of it that way, but like now that you mentioned it, I'm sure there's a few times when you go on like Instagram or something, it's like, who's the better female host? And you're like, well, they're both on different platforms. Why does this matter?
We all have something different to offer.
I want to ask, like, now, in doing your new show, what are some things that you really like about it, or things that you're thinking like, all right, like if from an outside point of view, let's put it this way. If you were trying to compel me to watch the show and you're basically saying, I've seen the promos, but I'm like, okay, I'm not sold. What are some things that you could sell me on the show to make me watch it?
For me, I really love hearing from the people at the heart of the story. So the people who are directly impacted. You know, so I try to focus less on, you know, the experts and the political pundits and the analysts. I want to hear from real people who are experiencing something, about how something is impacting them, and hearing their stories. So that's something that we really try to do a lot of. We also try as much as we can to do stories that maybe aren't making the headlines or maybe aren't at the top of the news agenda. You know, that was something that we tried to do, especially around the election. You know, what are the topics that aren't being talked about in the debate? What are the topics that none of the leaders are mentioning? But, you know, we talked about people with disabilities and, you know, what they're looking for in this election. And we haven't heard any of the political leaders talk about that. Even this year with what's happening with the residential schools. And we thought there would be so much more conversation about Indigenous issues, and it wasn't really. And so, you know, giving an opportunity for folks to have that platform, even when it's not at the top of the news cycle or not in the agenda, how do we kind of think about what's being missed? What aren't we hearing? Who aren't we hearing from? And trying to bring those voices to the table.
Is it kind of like safe to say, not like trying to label it, but is it kind of safe to say it's kind of like a voice for maybe the voiceless, or a voice for a little bit of like diversity and disability in a sense? Because I know
we do try to bring in marginalized voices, and you know, there's a saying from an author who says there's no such thing as the voiceless, only the deliberately silenced, right? And that's the idea that we have an opportunity, we have a platform to hear from these people. We can go to these communities, we can reach out to them, we just choose not to, right? So how do we use these platforms? And we talk about it being Canada tonight. That's all of Canada, right? Often not all of Canada gets heard from. And that includes even, you know, geographical diversity, you know, doing stories in different places, often because newsrooms are set in big cities, you know, Toronto, Vancouver. Those tends to be the stories that we focus on, because that's what the people who are making decisions about it are interested in, are impacted on. So how do we tap into the other communities that don't have as much access to the newsroom, and make sure we're talking about issues that are impacting them, because they are Canadians as well?
Yeah, I want to ask this, and this is going to probably be the equivalent of when someone says, when I say I'm a Newfoundlander, and they're like, oh, do you know Joe from Newfoundland? So, you know, at least I made the joke here. But like, you know, I've interviewed Hannah Ryan Singh, and now he obviously has like the turban, a part of his kind of comfort zone, I guess, and part of his background. But I thought it was really interesting when his response was, when we asked him, like, there are people, I guess, out west in Calgary that will come up to him and be like, you know, you're an inspiration because I see you do Calgary Flames games, and they believe that now they can make, you know, the same platform as him. It's kind of maybe a two-parter. Like, have you ever had these kind of conversations with Hannah Ryan Singh? Have you ever met him? And if
I've never met him.
Oh, really? Okay. Well, then, yeah.
I've never met him. Never talked to him. But it's really cool to see other people who also have never had an opportunity to have a platform like this. And I want to see more of it, whether it's, you know, Muslims, like you say, people with disabilities. You know, there's so many different demographics that aren't represented in mainstream media, that are left out, and I want to see more of that. You know, it's really great and exciting to be the first, but I don't want to be the only, and I don't want to be the last. And you know, I have there are at least 2 other women in hijab who work in news in different news stations in Canada, which is really exciting for me. Also because, you know, I can't be everything for everyone. In the sense
you can't?
that,
what?
In the sense that, you know, I'm, you know, yes, I'm Muslim, but, you know, I also have a very different experience than lots of Muslims in Canada do. We have, you know, Muslims have so many different languages and socioeconomic backgrounds and, you know, interests in different things. So for me, you know, I can't represent the 1 million Muslims across Canada, just like you can't represent every person with disability. Your experiences are also different. So we need to see a broad range of them, of people from these different backgrounds represented, because we're all going to bring different perspectives.
No, that's fair. I just, let me make a note. Ginella says I can't represent everyone with a disability. No, I'm only kidding. Imagine if someone was just like, you didn't know that already. I'm like, no, I just kind of clued in. No.
Or this idea that like, okay, let me get the disability perspective. I'm going to ask Tobin.
Oh, absolutely.
I asked Tobin, and Tobin told me this, right?
Yeah.
And so
because I would know it all.
Right, exactly,
yeah,
right.
yeah.
And so this idea that like you are the representative or you are the spokesperson for this one group that you happen to, relate to. But and then they feel like, oh, they checked the box. Well, I asked Tobin, and Tobin told me this, so that's it. I'm done, right?
We have a meeting once a year to figure out who our new leader is. And
exactly.
This year it was me. Next year
you were
I'll be like, hold on. But I represented Sturge Weber, and they'll be like, yeah, but you didn't represent Dave over there in a wheelchair. So this is Dave's time. I'd be like, oh my God. But yeah, no, that's fair. I guess I'll go back to the school side first. But with the school side, when you were doing communications and with journalism, like, I know you mentioned earlier that there was a teacher that kind of said, okay, like, I'm worried about this, but like, were you comfortable all the time wearing it, like right from day one, or was it something that you kind of adapted into?
Yeah, I've worn hijab most of my life. I started wearing hijab in elementary school. And actually, when I started wearing it, I was probably too young to be wearing it, but my mom and my sister were, and I wanted to be like them. And my mom was like, she didn't want me to wear it. And I was very stubborn. So she's like, all right, do you? And she let me be. So, growing up in Toronto, it's a very multicultural and diverse city. And so I didn't really feel like an outsider or an other because it wasn't uncommon to see not just Muslims, but people from lots of different backgrounds and lots of different places. And that was usual. I will say, after 9/11, I was in high school when 9/11 happened. And my mom was really scared for me and my sister. And she actually asked us, do you want to remove it? And we were both like, no, like we won't be, kind of fearful. We shouldn't live in fear, right? We should be able to be who we are. We haven't done anything wrong, and we shouldn't be afraid, and we should be proud of who we are. And, we saw it as more like a moment of education, as we talked about earlier, right? Ignorance and assumption. And I was always happy when people would ask me questions because it gave me an opportunity to actually inform them rather than just let them kind of go on in their ignorance. So for me, yeah, I've always kind of felt pretty comfortable in my skin, in my hijab. What was challenging for me was when I first went into a newsroom, and coming from a very diverse and multicultural city like Toronto, I was shocked when I went into my first newsroom in Toronto, in the biggest local newsroom in the country. And it was not diverse. It did not look like Toronto. That was when I first felt like an outsider. I did feel very different. I stuck out because there wasn't a lot of people of color in the newsroom, let alone, a woman in hijab. And so that was a challenge. But again, kind of for me, it was an opportunity to engage in conversations with people, about me and who I am. And at the end of the day, they would realize like, oh, she's not very different. Like, she's still very Canadian. And to me, I don't see those identities at odds with each other.
I feel like very similar to what you said there, because I remember when I did my internship with it was Global Toronto, and I'm coming from Newfoundland, and like I think it's almost kind of not to go against what you said, but it's like I went up there and I'm like, okay, so I see like there was like people with Mexican heritage, there was people with like Italian, and like they're representing, and then they'd be like pitching stories of like, why don't we do this in the Italian community? I'm like, and I'd be like looking there like beady eyes, like, all right, like how are you gonna tell him no? Like, tell me how you're gonna tell him no? Like, and then they'd be like, oh, we can discuss that. And I'm like, okay. And then it'd be like the Newfoundlander pitches an idea. It's like, I don't know nothing about Toronto. It's like, can I do a Leaf story? And they're like, can you say that again, but less fast? I'm like, okay. I'm like, can I do a Leaf story? And they're like, okay, easy. Don't get tone with us. I'm like, I'm not going to work here. It's like either I'm too fast or too, like, or you're saying I don't
like
communicate
even just
enough.
Your accent was something that was foreign and difficult for them to understand.
Yeah, I mean, I don't like. For me, I think the first year at Carleton, I would always ask people, "What are you at?" And they'd be like, "Come again?" And I'd be like, "Oh, they probably didn't hear me. What are you at?" And then they'd be like, "What do you mean?"
What does that mean?
Yeah, I'm like, "Oh, it just means what's up." And they're like, "Why don't you say that?" I'm like, it wouldn't click in because I was kind of like stubborn with you with the hijab. I was kind of like, no, I know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And then it would take a 5-minute conversation to get like 2 words out. And I'm like, you know what? I'm just going to ask you, hey, what's up? And they're like, hey, you're from Newfoundland. I don't know the accent. I'm like, I can't win. The last thing I want to ask is, like, you know, for people out there that whether they have a disability, whether they're just trying to make it in the media, whether they're someone like yourself, what's some kind of insight or maybe inspirational, I don't know, quote that you can give them to be like, hey, keep going? Or maybe you could just be like, hey, I'm the only one here. Don't come near me.
No, not at all. There's room for all of us. I definitely fight a lot of imposter syndrome. I definitely have those moments where I feel like, oh my God, you know, how did I even get here? You know, they're going to find me out. They're going to realize that I'm not as smart as I, you know, appear to be, or I'm not as good as they thought I was. And honestly, I fake it a lot. I fake confidence a lot. And that helps me get through it. And so my motto has been for a long time is fake it till you make it, in the sense that, like, you have to show people that you think you deserve to be here, and that, you know, will give them the confidence to see that you deserve to be here. I think if you don't believe in yourself, no one else will. And so for me, at least, if I don't believe in myself, I at least pretend that I do. and I fake it a lot. So yeah, that and a lot of persistence. Don't take no for an answer. I mean, Tobin, that's how you got this interview, right?
Yeah,
so you know that well.
Yeah, it's fair. Backstory is I went to Ginella's house, knocked on the door, and she's like, please leave me alone. And I'm just like, one interview, please. And she's
How
like, one interview and leave.
Yeah.
That's going to do it for this episode of Tobin Tonight. Our thanks to Ginella Massa for coming on to the show. Remember, you can get past episodes on TobinTonight.com, Spotify, and iTunes. Follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, and leave a comment or two. For Tobin and myself, this is Jacob saying thank you for listening, and good night.